Today, or my talk today is entitled Mary Shepheard's Threefold Variety of Intellect and its Role in Improving Education. The picture you have here is rather symbolic for should be taken with a grain of salt, obviously, but it's intended to symbolize the state of education that Mary Shepheard was, or the background where Mary Shepheard was writing against or from. So this picture appeared in a Norfolk newspaper in 1780. So that's basically 3 years after Shepheard was born. So I have two aims in my talk. First, I want to offer a new insight into Shepheard's theory of mind by establishing that she distinguishes between three groups of minds according to their various cognitive limitations. And secondly, I want to demonstrate how this distinction in particular relates to her aim of improving our educational practices. So as will become evident, Shepheard, or this will become evident and pertinent by the end of my talk, Shepheard is not what you could call an educational theorist per se, but there are rather various remarks she has on education. And it will be my job, or it's an exegetical task to combine these together and make a whole out of it. So this is my plan. I will start with the background, say a few words about Mary Shepheard, her works, and I will talk about her two causal principles. Anyone that has ever heard or read about Mary Shepheard will probably be aware of the fact that people who write about Shepheard like to talk about her notion of causation. And this has to do with the fact that she has a really idiosyncratic notion of causation, first of all. And second of all, her notion of causation just plays a hugely important role. Basically, it's a backdrop against everything she says is developed. So my talk is no exception to this rule. The two causal principles, I will just introduce them and not defend them or anything, but they also play an important role for her theory of mind and the classification she implicitly introduces there. So I will then proceed to provide you with what I take to be the basic of Shepheard, or the basics of Shepheard's notion of mind, and then go through these three groups of minds she distinguishes. And then I will start with the task of tying this threefold variety, or what she calls a threefold variety, together with her views on education as far as we can know them. So here you see so this is actually the only known portrait or painting we have of Mary Shepheard. She's the middle one. That's her at age of 14 in front of Barnable Castle, which is, I think it still belongs to descendants of her family, or the Primrose family, where she is born, or was born in. So Shepheard was born in 1777 and lived until 1847. And she is, as I said, not an educational theorist primarily, but she is actually mostly a metaphysician, and what Jennifer McRobert called Scotland's first female philosopher. As you can tell from the fact that we only have a painting of her at the age of 14, we do not know a lot about her background or the context. But so the best source we have is a memoir written by her daughter. And Jennifer McRobert did a lot of work to try to uncover her context, or the intellectual context she grew up in, as far as possible. And so we know by now, or can safely assume at least, that she grew up comparatively privileged and that she received a private education. But we have basically no clue or no information about the content of this education, but just know that she seems to have been a very good student, and she excelled or reached a comparatively high level in various subjects, ranging from mathematics to philosophy. We also know that she herself never attended university or received a formal degree, but that she was the center, more or less, of a large intellectual circle, and that she knew many scientists and intellectuals of her day, such as Charles Babbage, William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Ricardo, or Mary Somerville. And what's also evident from the publications is that her works seem to have been generally well regarded, or at least even people like Fern or Jekyll, who were critical, they were not indifferent, but they engaged with her works. But what happened to her works is what happened to to the works of many women philosophers. They basically dropped from view until the mid-90s, where Jennifer McRobert and Margaret Atherton made an effort to revive her work and point out the interesting philosophical content that Shepheard provides. So currently, we know Shepheard to be the author of 2 books and 3 essays. The essay, or the book that's most pertinent for my purpose, is the essays on the perception of the external universe, and the essay on the relation of cause and effect. That's her first book, which I will talk about briefly to introduce the important aspects of her notion of causality. So in RC, Shepheard attacks, I quote, Mr. Hume's doctrine of the relation of cause and effect. That is, she attacks a Humean notion of causation as constant conjunction. And in distinction to Hume, Shepheard wants to establish that causation is at least a tripartite relation, and that cause and effect are necessarily connected and synchronous. By this, she means to say that the effect is included in what she calls the mixture of causes. She likes to illustrate this understanding of cause and effect by mathematical analogies. I have a nice quote here where she writes, cause and effect might be represented by A times B equals C. Therefore, C is included in the mixture of the objects called cause. So A and B are supposedly the effects, and C is the cause. So they combine. So the combination of the effects is the cause. Also, in RC, she develops and argues for 2 what I call causal principles. I use the terminology here that's introduced by Deborah Boyle, but different interpreters prefer different terminology. Someone like M. Fasko doesn't like to speak about principles here. But no matter the terminology, we all agree on the content. So first of all, is the first principle, or what I call principle, is the causal principle, which states that nothing can begin its own existence. And the second principle is what I will call the causal likeness principle, which states that like causes must generate like effects. Both of them will play an important role when we talk about how to keep those different groups of minds apart. So, with this in mind, let me turn to the second part of my talk, that's introducing the basic of Shepheard's notion of mind. Shepheard defines or characterizes the mind as a capacity or cause for sensation in general. 1 second. Good. Excuse me. So, back to the topic. So the mind is a capacity or cause for sensation in general, or as Shepheard elsewhere puts it, the mind for her is a power. It's primarily a power. And she is adamant that the mind is not only, or that this power is not only continually existing, but also, and I quote here, immortal for the future. And so it's no surprise that Shepheard uses mind and soul interchangeably. For her, that's basically the same. So, but to understand what a mind is, because it's a power for sensation, it's important to understand what she means by sensation. And especially if you work in an early modern context, or coming like I do from an early modern context, Shepheard's notion of sensation is rather, or seems rather idiosyncratic, because she uses the term to denote any consciousness whatsoever. So sensation can be any mental state or process, period. Sensation is a really broad term. It's what she calls even a generic term that encompasses, and here is a list provided by her, sensation of present sensible qualities, sensation of the ideas of memory, sensations of the ideas of imagination, sensations of the ideas of reason, and so on. So it's a really broad term. And she also has a technical usage of perception. For her, a perception is not tied to sense perception, but to her, a perception is what she quote here, a sensation taken notice of by the mind. So it's what you could call, or what I will call, following Deborah Boyle's lead, a second order sensation. That is, it is a sensation that has been explicitly registered by the mind. So you have to imagine all the sensations we have are conscious, but they are not conscious in the way that we are explicitly aware of them. And that's the difference between a sensation and a perception. In any case, in distinction to many of her predecessors, she does not confine, or she does confine neither term to our 5 organs of sense. That's important to keep in the background, especially because perception also plays a rather important role when we come to the first group of minds. So, despite this broad, or maybe even precisely because it's a really broad term, it's worthwhile to try to introduce some classifications. And I think Shepheard's remarks lend hands to basically distinguish between 2 classes of sensations. On the one hand, you have what she calls feelings. That's basically the sensations of present sensible qualities and of passions such as pleasure or pain. And on the other hand, we have what I will call reasonings. And these reasonings include the various sensations of ideas. And again, coming from an early modern context, it's important to note, in general, it's important to note that she has a technical usage of idea. So an idea for her is that which results from thinking about, and I quote here, existences which have existed, may exist, will exist, must needs exist, but whose qualities are not presently determined upon the mind. So you basically have the feelings that are referring to things that are presently there, and you have the reasonings that refer to those, or that are about those feelings. That's the way Margaret Atherton puts it, and I find this rather helpful. Now, importantly for my purposes, I think there is a correspondence in terms of, or there are 2 faculties that correspond to these 2 classes of sensations. So when I speak of faculties here, it's important to note that by faculty, I don't mean a separate part or anything along those lines. So I take it seriously, as does Deborah Boyle, that the mind for Shepheard is a single power. So when I speak of 2 faculties, it's rather that you have to understand this along the way of there are 2 basic ways in which the mind can be actualized. And one way Shepheard describes as a power of feeling. So she says the mind is a power of feeling, or what I will call a faculty of sense. And this is rather unsurprisingly, this power of feeling is concerned with what Shepheard calls the objects of sense, or what I have called the feelings beforehand. The second way the mind can be actualized is as a power of thought, or what I will call the faculty of understanding. And this is concerned with what she calls the objects of the understanding, or what I have called reasonings beforehand. And what you will see in the following is that the distinction between different groups of mind is primarily one according to different degrees in their power of thought. So the power of feeling is important for her mind per se, but it does not play an important role in the story I'm about to tell. This is a story that's rather confined to our faculty of understanding, or the differences in the power of our faculty of understanding. So with this, let me turn to the threefold variety. Excuse me real quick. And I start with the first group, which I will call minds afflicted with idiocy. So here, first thing that's important to note is that Shepheard speaks about idiots and idiocy, and it seems evident from her text that she at least intends to use this terminology in a medical sense that was rather common in the 19th century. And it's her way to, as you will see in a minute, it's her way to refer to what we would call an intellectual disability. Nonetheless, it's important to keep in mind that the way she speaks about this phenomena does raise some concerns or issues about whether she makes use of an ableist language, especially since medical intention does not override potential harm. And also in that vein of raising awareness of the potential problems that her remarks raise, It's important to note that she characterizes idiocy as an inborn defect that afflicts the mind of some infants. And the infants in question are human, or are primarily or only human infants. And I mean, this alone does not raise the issue of speciesism, but this characterization is part of a larger set of remarks where she seems to set the mind, or the human mind, apart from the minds of other species, and also does so in a way that attributes a higher moral value to these human minds. So this does not directly point to the issue of speciesism, but it also ties into this larger issue that she was likely a speciesist. Good. Now, let me start with what are the limitations of mind-afflicted idiocy. And Shepheard characterizes these limitations thusly, I quote, it's an incapacity for further perception than what resides in the immediate impressions created by the use of the 5 organs of sense and the power of motion. And in another place she says, their understanding cannot take notice of certain simple relations included in those ideas of sensation, which are determined to their mind by their organs of sense. So here, when she talks about perception, she's using perception in her technical sense. So what she says is that mind afflicted with idiocy cannot become consciously, or can only become consciously aware of the immediate sense or the immediate impressions of sense they have. They cannot become consciously aware, for instance, of the relations that obtain between those sense impressions. And this incapacity to become consciously aware of relation means that a mind afflicted with idiocy lacks access to the causal principle and the causal likeness principles. And this in turn means that they have no causal knowledge at all if they don't have access to the CP or the CLP. And this lacking causal knowledge in turn then means that they cannot become aware of the existence of a continuously existing external world. Because as Shepheard argues, and I'm happy to talk about this argument in more detail in the Q&A, but here I just hope you'll trust me. Shepheard argues that you need the CP, or the CP, the causal principle is for her an important premise in her argument for the existence of a continually existing external world, and an argument which she says any can do. So they cannot do that because they have no awareness of relations at all. And Shepheard repeatedly points out that the CLP, that the causal likeness principles, is extremely important for us to learn from the past. And as she puts it in the case of minds afflicted with idiocy, the lack or that they do not have access to the CLP just means that they cannot learn from the past because there is nothing that would, and that's her words, govern their expectations of the future. So in short, a mind afflicted with idiocy is basically trapped in a chaos of seemingly unconnected sense impressions, which for such a mind seem to exist only, or for someone afflicted with idiocy seems to exist only in their head, because they cannot even become consciously aware of the fact that the external world exists, nor do they have any clue what this external world would be like or what they could expect from interacting with it. So they basically have no noteworthy power of thought at all, because they're really trapped basically in the moment, and they only have access or proper access to their feelings, and they're not capable really of making reasonings or becoming consciously aware of stuff. So with this, let me turn to the second group, and this is a group I will call, we can call inferior understandings, following Shepheard's terminology, basically. The group of inferior understandings is a rather large group because it encompasses human children, what Shepheard calls peasants, and brutes. Brutes is Shepheard's term for non-human animals, and peasants seems to be Shepheard's term for lower class people who had little to no education. And so this is also why I highlighted this problem of ableism and speciesism, because peasants, for instance, there is a derogatory use of peasants, which was common since the 16th century to refer to lower class people, and the fact that Shepheard makes this kind of usage just plays into the worry of her maybe also being an ableist, and also using brutes. I mean, brutes was a common term to refer to non-human animals, but I mean, let me put it this way, it's not the nicest way to refer to non-human animals, and there are alternatives. In any case, to come back to the issue at hand, what will become evident now is that these inferior understandings, they are one group because of their similar level of understanding, of the faculty of understanding. So let me start first with the abilities they have and then talk about the limitations they have. Ability-wise, what sets them apart from minds afflicted with idiocy is that they have access to the causal principle. As Shepheard puts it, thus, to begin of itself would appear to every child under the faint and most indistinct form of latent conception to be a contradiction. And the only children that do not have this faintest and most indistinct form of latent conceptions are minds afflicted with idiocy. And or referring to the CLP, she writes, but the contradictory notion is never held by infants who have not the misfortune to be born idiots, that objects can be similar objects and nevertheless their exhibitions be different. So her claim is anyone except idiots will know that the CLP, that like causes or must have like effects, holds. So that's what they can do better than minds afflicted with idiocy, but there are also important limitations. The first important limitation they have is that Shepheard thinks they are limited in their ability to analyze relations, such as causation. And analysis for her, it becomes evident elsewhere, analysis for her is a form of examination in which you break down complexity and which in turn requires abstraction. And abstraction she characterizes as, and I quote, the consideration of any quality apart from others with which it may be usually united in order to notice what inferences may be drawn from its nature. So long story short, inferior understandings are not really good in analyzing relations because they have trouble keeping certain qualities or keeping certain relata, for instance, apart, or keeping qualities that are part of the relata apart. So one way to illustrate this, and I will focus here on the notion of causation, is that, and it's a point explicitly made by Shepheard as well. So she says inferior understandings only insufficiently distinguish between effects and other qualities, precisely because they are limited in their ability to abstract. So her example is a child that has burned her fingers on a candle, and then she writes about this child. So she says, this child or ignorant person will realize that there is some object which is not in themselves and which will also affect their touch with a painful sense of burning. Yet this person will not correctly identify all and only those qualities which, in Shepheard's words, efficiently govern the burning of the flesh. Rather, what happens, according to Shepheard, is that such a child will think that the object she sees is a burning and also painful object. So to put it differently, the child will not realize that, for instance, will not realize that only the flame of the candle has the capacity to burn her fingers, but she will take the whole candle or the whole object she'll take as a burning object and will probably refrain from touching the candle as a whole because she's not sure what precisely burned her about this candle. She just knows this thing out there, it causes pain. That's what Shepheard is alleging here. So this is the first limitation. The second important limitation they have is that they lack what Shepheard calls good sense when they draw causal inferences, because often these inferences are based on, to use her word, insufficient data. But she means that inferior understandings, such as children, lack access to the causal history of certain objects, or that they fail to adequately consider the causal history. And so what happens is that inferior understandings are too ready or objects for them are considered too readily as similar. I like to illustrate this point of Shepheard by modifying this child example. So you have to imagine now that the child that has burned her fingers on a candle sees an electric candle for the first time in her life, and the electric candle looks really similar to a real candle. And what happens, according to Shepheard, is that this child will think that this electric candle is also a burning object and one that will cause pain if you touch it. So she will refrain from touching it, because she lacks causal knowledge about this object. She doesn't know about its causal history, and she only has insufficient data here because it's her first exposure to electric candle. So what you can say then about inferior understandings is that in the light of the knowledge of causation that we have by philosophy and other sciences, that their causal analyses, or more generally all their relational analyses and inferences, are deficient. To the best of our knowledge, their inferences are deficient. But it's important to note that the analyses they make are often sufficient for the purposes of ordinary daily life. So if you think again about the child, if you stipulate, and I think it's reasonable to stipulate, that the main goal of this child is not to burn her fingers again, and in the case of the electric candle, she is successful in terms of this particular goal. She will not burn her fingers if she does not touch the candle. And of course, she would have not burned her fingers if she were to touch the candle. But the point is, the fingers are not burned. So from that perspective, her analysis is a success, even though it's a success for the wrong reasons, as it were. So they're deficient from a theoretical, the analyses are deficient from, you could say, a theoretical perspective, but often sufficient from a more practical perspective. And also inferior understandings, and this is in distinction to minds afflicted with idiocy, can come to know that the external world exists because they have access to the CP, and they can get some idea about what it is like, and they can learn from the past and adapt their future expectations and also their behavior because they have access to the causal likeness principle. So with this, let me turn to the third and final group of Shepheard's threefold variety, and these are sound understandings. The first thing to note here is that Shepheard does neither define sound understandings in the way she does inferior understandings, nor does she give a nice list of the group members. What she actually says is, and I quote here, "There is displayed every variety of intellect, through every gradation from that of an almost total absence of it, as in the case of idiocy, to the biased determinations resulting from the soundest understandings." So what I did, I adopted this term of soundest understandings and just basically created a group out of it just above the inferior understandings. So these are the understandings, or the soundest understandings are what I will call just sound understandings. And group member wise, she does not really give an explicit list, as so this is a difference to the inferior understandings, but it seems that philosophers, or at least what Shepheard would call good philosophers, are somewhat or something akin to her ideal epistemic agent. So sound understandings are typically adult human beings that are rather well educated. So, and again, let me first point out the abilities they have and then comment on their limitations. So what sets sound understandings apart from inferior understandings, according to Shepheard, is that they can draw correct causal, or more generally relational, inferences and analyses to the best of our available knowledge. Then Shepheard points out that they have the most comprehensive knowledge of what she calls the nature and reality of external existence. And what's also specific to them is that they can express the results in a formal and general way that's beyond the reach of inferior understandings. And this is tightly connected to the fourth point, namely that they can argue formally on subjects such as causality. So this ability to argue formally means allows them to defend their analysis, for instance, in a way that's beyond inferior understandings, and also to discuss their analyses in a way that's beyond inferior understandings. However, so it's what or let me put it this way. So the sound understandings, they're basically capable of doing what's possible for a finite mind to do, but that does not mean that they are godlike, as it were. So they have also limitations. For instance, they cannot know the essences of bodies or the mind. No, according to Shepheard, no finite being can. Sandra Lindblom called this Shepheard's epistemic humility towards essences, which I think is a pretty apt description. So there are boundaries to the knowledge and to the capacities and abilities of sound understandings as well. There are just, those boundaries are different compared to the ones of inferior understandings. So what they actually can do is they can do science, and they can push, so the boundaries that exist for them as well, at least what they can do is sound understanding can push those boundaries or can push the boundaries of knowledge to its most outer edge. So they have the highest level of understanding. They have, they can accumulate anything basically that's humanly possible to accumulate knowledge-wise. And what's also an interesting feature about them, that's something Shepheard does not say explicitly, but which seems to fall out of her theory implicitly, is that only a sound understanding can become consciously aware of the limitations they have. So epistemic humility is a feature of sound understanding. So they understand, to adopt Socrates a little bit, is basically they understand that they are not capable of understanding everything, and only they can understand. Good. With this, let me turn to the connection between this threefold variety and Shepheard's notion. And here a contrast picture. It's disappeared in a Norwich newspaper and is supposedly depicting an all-girls school. So, as I said, Shepheard is not an educational theorist, and so her remarks raise some issues for us, and or one particular challenge I want to focus on. So she says that her main aim in analyzing the operations of the mind from infancy is motivated by the wish to improve our knowledge of causation and the external world. But she also explicitly says that her theory of mind could improve the practices of, and I quote here, physiologists and physicians, moralists and divines, parents and instructors with regard to those under their care. So Shepheard, so the first part is to say that Shepheard does explicitly say her theory of mind is not the one that's subservient to education primarily, but she thinks it can have a positive influence on education. But the problem we have as interpreters is that she never spells out how this is supposed to work. And this is what I will attempt to do in the following. And I will do this by first trying to clarify her notion of education, talk about the reason she introduces this variety, and then connect these two things with each other. As soon as I want to talk about Shepheard's notion of education, we have a different problem arises, or a second part of the problem, if you want to, and that is that Shepheard has very little to say about it, or very little to say about it explicitly, at least, because it seems that she has a strong interest in education. This is, on the one hand, attested by the previous remark, and also there is a reference to James Mill's pamphlet on education. And in fact, it seems rather certain that she was personally acquainted with Mill. And Mill, I think you can say, was arguably one of the leading educational theorists in the British-Scottish intellectual milieu of the time. And if we assume that Mill was also part of her larger intellectual circle and that she discussed with him, it seems safe to assume that they also discussed about education, especially given the references she makes. So yeah, she has an interest, but for some reason, it's not really an issue that is prevalent in her writings. So it's upon me or any other interpreter to find out more or less what her notion of education looks like. And what I think here, so let me start with talking about the people that do the educating. And I think it would, or it is arguably in line with her views to call these professions, so the physiologists and so on, we could call them pedagogues in the broad sense of those who teach or offer guidance. Actually, I would prefer to call them agogues, but as far as I'm aware, this is not a thing in English. So in German, there's Agogik, which is basically pedagogics, which is not focused on children, obviously, but it's really, it's about people who are educators for other people, also for human people that can offer guidance, assistance, whatever. And so this is more, I think, in line with what Shepheard has in mind, because it will become evident she's not so much focused on the education of children, but of people or living beings per se. So in any case, I will, for the sake of it, I will call them pedagogues now. And what unites this rather heterogeneous group, ranging from physiologists to parents, is that they have people under their care whom they educate on various issues. And I quote here, with respect to their health, opinion, and their practices. So we have a rather heterogeneous group of people that has a rather broad job to do, because we have health, opinion, and practices. So this is a rather big field that Shepheard has here in mind. So I think it's fair and safe to say that she has a really broad notion of education, which combines, and I take here definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary. It basically combines what you could call the culture or development of personal knowledge or understanding, growth of character, moral and social qualities, with a process of looking after a person or animal with respect to food and other physical needs. So it's really a broad notion. And what I think is important as a takeaway is it's not restricted to children. It's maybe not even restricted to humans. And it's certainly not focused or solely focused on formal education, but it's really education for her, you could say, is a notion of life, of the practices of daily life. So now let me talk about why she thinks we should care about education in the first place. So now we have some idea what she means by education, but why should we care about education? And her rationale seems to be that education matters because it can make a difference. At least that's what she seems to say in the following quote. She says, referring to the bodily actions of sentient capacities, the latter is as multifarious as food, medicine, and climate, the circulation of the blood, the passions, the habits of educations, and the notion of individuals can render it. So to put it differently, Shepheard seems to say that the way we are educated, amongst other things, influences the way we interact, or we act and interact with the world. So this is basically the first part of the answer, but I think Shepheard has an even stronger view when it comes to education. So it does not only matter because it makes a difference, it actually matters because it helps to improve the way we interact and act with the world. And it helps to improve this precisely because it helps to develop our understanding. And this becomes, or not evident, but is suggested if you consider, or first of all, consider that the intellect comes in various gradations. So you have basically a scale, as she said in the quote I had before on EPU 116. So we have a low degree and we have a higher degree. And it seems rather obvious that you can ascend from a lower degree to a higher degree. And this is especially obvious if you consider that human children are considered as inferior understandings, but there is no principled reason for them not to develop a sound understanding, obviously provided that something is done to help them, or their understanding is nourished and developed in the first place. And so it's not only the fact that there is no principled reasons that would prevent children from developing an understanding, but Shepheard is rather committed to the opposite position, because she says that inferior understandings, including children, have the capacity to abstract. And Shepheard calls this truly the origin of all science. So, of course, Shepheard does not mean that that children and non-human animals can do science, but what she says here is that they have in virtue of having the capacity to abstract, they have the foundation that's necessary to develop a mind that will be capable of reasoning on a scientific level. And so also to further support my claim that she has a developmental view of the mind and that you can basically ascend from a lower to a higher degree, also consider that she says that the reasonings of inferior understandings are analogous to the philosophers, which are sound understandings, up to a certain point. So of course there are limitations, but there is no structural difference, as it were. So, but they do analogous things, but at some point they cannot count in on the potential that the philosopher, for instance, has. But the reasoning is basically the same. It's just what they do with this reasoning is not the same. And finally, I think we have even a rather explicit commitment to a developmental view when Shepheard says, or when she points out that a young adult does not remember its state as a young child, and the young child does not remember its state as an infant, or the infant its state as a fetus. But she says about those states, each of these mental states improves by what it has learned in knowledge, if not in virtue, from that which immediately preceded it. So there seems to be a story of gradual development, starting from the fetus to the adult. And it seems obvious, or it's pretty strongly suggested, I think, that what helps this improvement is education. So now we have talked about education. Now let me focus on the variety. And the interesting question, or the big question to me was when I looked into this, was why introduce or why have these remarks that strongly suggest this classificatory scheme in the first place? And one thought you can have is that she introduces this to highlight how great the sound understanding and philosophers are, in the same way that many early modern philosophers like Descartes or Berkeley, who sometimes speak of themselves as the pinnacle, basically, of any understanding. So you could think that Shepheard has something similar in mind, but it seems that she has rather a different concern. And this becomes evident to me, or I think it becomes evident when you take into account that she repeatedly defends inferior understandings. For instance, when she highlights the ways in which they are not inferior per se compared to sound understandings. So, for instance, as I said, she does not think that any philosopher has a sound understanding, but only the good philosophers. And there are various passages where she says that children have a better or truer notion of cause than many present-day philosophers, for instance. So calling them inferior understandings should not be taken as derogatory here, but only really pointing to a comparative limitation or comparative to the sound understandings, to the limitations they have, and not to a moral value or anything along those lines. So what I think she's actually doing, she's very much concerned with providing a realistic and adequate picture of our abilities to reason at different stages of our cognitive development. 1 second. Wolltest du Hoi sagen?
Hoi, 2
Genau. Und jetzt muss ich aber weitermachen. Ich muss Ihnen etwas erzählen über Shepheard. Darfst du mit dem nehmen da?
Aber ich brauche ja keine Hoi sehen.
Ja, hat sie schon gefunden. Schau mal, wie super. Okay. So, from my personal educational or my capacity per educator, back to my views on Shepheard's view on Shepheard on education. Good. So I think the variety is introduced to provide us with a realistic and adequate pictures of our abilities and to provide us with a more comprehensive understanding of of the cognitive development of the mind. So now, if we take those things together, so I think we can know, or at least safely assume, that Shepheard is committed to the view that her theory of mind, including the distinction between the 3 varieties of intellect, can help to improve our educational practices. And I think it's also safe to assume that the introduction of the variety, or the purpose of the introduction, is to refine our notion of the mind and its developmental stages. And we also saw that Shepheard believes that education matters because it can improve our understanding and our ability to cope with ordinary daily life. Or at least I think these are safe inferences we can draw. So if you put this together, we get the following implicit rationale. I think that Shepheard's threefold distinction can contribute, or in Shepheard's mind, it will contribute to the improvement of our educational practices precisely because it provides us with a more comprehensive and realistic notion of our differing cognitive capacities and abilities at different developmental stages. Because I think Shepheard believes that this will allow pedagogues to improve their practices by giving them the means to adjust their expectations and what they say do in light of the cognitive needs and limitations of the people they have to educate. So the idea basically is simple. The better you understand the mind, the better you understand the different developmental stages of the mind and understand what stage the person you have to educate on something particular is in, the more goal-oriented and the more need-oriented you can make, or you can design the way you educate this person. And so to illustrate this, take the example we had before, that inferior understandings are too quick in judging things to be similar because these judgments are based on insufficient data. Now, if you are a pedagogue that has such an inferior understanding in front of itself, and you know that this is their problem and you know the reason for this problem, it basically allows you to tackle the issue at its core. And you can really then structure the way you will rectify this issue. So, for instance, you can help them to improve their knowledge about the causal history of objects. And you can do that by providing them with more data or teaching them ways in which they can collect further data themselves. Or you can show them how this data ought to be used when you draw causal inferences. So I think this is to be taken as an illustration of a more general point of the way that a better understanding of the mind will result in a better education, which in turn will result in a better development or a more goal-oriented development of the mind. So with this, let me just draw my conclusions and provide you with some upshots. So my goal, or my first goal, was to analyze Shepheard's threefold variety of intellect, and I have argued that it's a distinction of three groups of minds in virtue of their differing level of intellect or power of thought. And my second goal was to demonstrate how this distinction relates to her aim of improving our educational practices. And as I said, I think this is done by providing a more realistic and adequate picture of the differing developmental stages of the mind, which in turn will serve to adjust the expectations of pedagogues, to identify weaknesses of the people that have to be educated, and then take this together to improve the ways those people are taught. And as upshots of this whole story, I see the following two main upshots. So I think that understanding the threefold variety does provide a novel insight into Shepheard's theory of mind, because we gain insight into the fact that there is a development, and we learn what the different stages there are and what sets these stages apart, and basically what is the lowest, the highest degree of rationality you can have. And in turn, understanding the connection to our educational practices does shed a light on how different aspects of Shepheard's philosophical corpus relate to each other, and it helps to demonstrate that her concern with metaphysics is not isolated, but that it's again a different instance of the fact that her views, or how her views of causation also inform the way she thinks about the mind, which in turn informs the way she thinks about education. So it's basically, it further testifies to the coherent system that she has developed over the course of her career. Yes, and with this, I thank you for your attention.